25 years ago today, something special happened in Japan. For the first time, the general public could play a console action RPG online. 25 years ago was the release of Phantasy Star Online. To us, today, this is normal. Benign, even. Sometime in the late aughts or early 2010s, going online ceased to be special. Especially as live service games and always online requirements became a nuisance. And then now, in the 2020s, the internet is something we want to escape from rather than something to escape to like it used to be. But back in the early aughts, there was still a magic to going online. PSO wasn't my first online game where I got to communicate with other players. That was Monster Hunter Tri, nearly a decade later, but there was a magic to it then, so I can't even begin to fathom what it was like for those first pioneers. And over these last couple years, I've covered nearly the entire Phantasy Star Online series. Certainly all the main ones that came to the West. It's been a journey. Many hours of videos, and 1,000 or 2,000 hours of game time put into research. Hell, according to Steam, I'm over 1,000 hours on PSO2 and New Genesis alone, plus I know I have several hundred hours on PSO and PSU. It's been one hell of a time. You know, I've been here for just over 2/3 of those 25 years, and I still feel like a series newcomer. I joined with Phantasy Star Zero, and maybe it's just because after Phantasy Star Zero, we got Portable 2, and then the whole series said, fuck it, I'm out to the West for like 10 years. So I got into the series, and then almost immediately after it became dormant and not something I thought about much until these past few years. Heck, it kind of became my channel's focus on accident. My original PSO2 video just kind of kept getting views. So after that, and after doing a video on the original PSO that similarly kept getting views, I just kind of decided, well, I'm a Phantasy Star channel now. And with pretty good timing, considering I had just enough time to cover everything I wanted to before the anniversary. But it does work out, since these sorts of online action RPGs rooted in Japanese console games are some of my favorite games out there. Phantasy Star Online, Monster Hunter, even Dark Souls to a degree are some of my favorite series and some of the ones that I've spent the most time with over the years. But now, on the anniversary, here we are nearly at the end of the series. There's a few side games, and I currently don't have the capacity to cover Nova, but this is all the action RPG PSO games that have had an official English release. So if you're watching this, this may as well be the core canon for the series. I've covered all of them. Could I have done better with some of my coverage? Sure, but down that way lies madness in remaking the same video over and over again. So this makes this video my last word on all of the Phantasy Star Online titles I've covered. At least until like the 30th anniversary or some other good reason to recover these. And we will be covering everything here, albeit briefly. So let's take one last look back at the saga of Phantasy Star Online. So let's take a look back over the series. In the internet's favorite forum, a tier list, ranking every game in the series from C to S. Why C to S? Well, for one, that's the range of weapon ranks in the Gurhal saga, so it's a cute little nod. But also because I don't really think there's any truly painfully bad games in the series. The worst ones are just kind of mediocre, but still I think get a passing grade. And I'm not the kind of hyperbolic guy to act like that makes them the worst thing ever. So yes, I will be ranking nearly every game with a few exceptions. None of the classic Phantasy Star games, not PSO Episode 3, not Phantasy Star Nova, not any of the mobile games, and not the tabletop RPG. These are all either not stuff that can be meaningfully compared to these action RPGs, not stuff I'm able to play, or both. And as we go over what I am covering, I'll summarize my thoughts on them, so consider it a big re-retrospective on all of them. But if you want a real deep dive, check the playlist for the video in question. I'll put a link up in the card to that right now, and as I go through it, I will also put up cards for the individual videos where I cover each game, time. Firstly, we have the C-tier games, which are the ones that I can't really recommend unless you're trying to play the entire franchise like I have. They're still fine games, you just have better options here, and they don't do enough to make themselves stand out against the rest of the series. First, Phantasy Star Universe Ambition of the Illuminous Offline. And yeah, with how many different versions of PSU there are, you could probably guess that some of them are going to be filling out the lower tiers. And AOTI Offline is honestly just the worst of them. The story isn't as good as base offline or portable, and the gameplay isn't developed as portable or private server online mode. Plus, the story is incomplete anyway. AOTI was a two-part story, the second part was online only, and because these files were server-side, it's not available on the private server. There was a lot of potential here. The attacks committed by the Illuminous are fucking horrifying. But ultimately, the end of the first part of the story reveals that their leader's actually just a generic doomsday villain. And then things end on a cliffhanger that you could only follow up these days by watching the second half online. There's just not much reason to play AOTI offline these days, and hell, there probably wasn't much reason even at the time. It would have been a pretty disappointing expansion if you didn't play it online, and like with PSU's offline, I suspect the offline mode only existed at all because, well, this was still back when these games had to be sold as physical discs in stores, and the expansion also needed to be sold physically, though only on the PS2. Online-only games were borderline unheard of in the console space at the time, but unlike the vanilla PSU offline, there's nothing really special about this. As for Phantasy Star Portable, it is C-tier for the same reason that AOTI Offline was. While there are some legitimate issues you can have with the private servers, I'd just rather play those than Phantasy Star Portable. Although conversely, it is the best PSU experience you can have offline right now in terms of gameplay, and heck, I did get at least one comment by someone who prefers Phantasy Star Portable to the private servers, and, you know, fair. I am mixed on some of the ways that the private servers streamline things, even if I do greatly appreciate certain bits like the improved EXP rate, and this is probably the closest you can get to the full PSU quality without those changes. It's just not as good as PSU Online. It doesn't look as good, the gameplay options are still a little abridged, they're missing PSU's exceptional class and progression system, but there is some cool stuff here that I admittedly only glimpsed briefly. It introduced class-based drop tables, and I really like how much it emphasizes collecting titles. I admittedly did not give this game as fair a shake as I should have, and maybe I will go back to it sometime to do the stuff after the main story. I maintain that I kinda made the game worse by playing it so shortly after PSU, but at the same time, the game came out when PSU was also live, so maybe I'd rather be playing PSU would, if anything, be a more relevant criticism at the time. And hey, at least the game had a better story than its sequel, even if the sequel is otherwise the better game. And last, and probably at the top of C tier, is, much to my disappointment, Phantasy Star Zero. Zero is a rough game. It gets a lot from the original PSO wrong, losing most of the RPG system depth while failing to be as good of an action game as those that would come after it. I still like it, it's ultimately still kinda unique, and it's a game that you can experience the story of in 10 hours and get most of the fun from it in 20 to 30 tops. So it's a bit easier to recommend for this reason. It doesn't overstay its welcome. It's the best C-tier game, but it just doesn't have that much to offer unless you really want to play all of the franchise and understand it better. Because I do actually think most of its value lies in helping to understand the original PSO better. Look, I've been around this series long enough to remember the old PSO versus PSU flame wars on PSO World. I remember how much of the dislike for PSU was based on things that were an iconic part of PSO, but got scrapped. Zero is interesting because it does bring back a lot of surface level elements from PSO, but gets them wrong in a way that suggests the designers were mostly just familiar with PSU. Phantasy Star Zero brings back mags, but without the emphasis on stats and with little of the complexity to raising them, so it's usually encouraged to just raise your main attacking stat on your mag. Zero restores the ability to cast text without a casting weapon equipped, but they're still mostly reliant on having a casting weapon in order to deal good damage like in PSU, and very few are designed in a way that they would have the utility that they had in PSO. The class system looks like PSO, but it's greatly simplified with none of the nuance to separate variants of the same class like PSO had. Even being as generous as I can, Zero has 9 classes to PSO's 12. Less optimistically, 7 classes. Cynically, you could probably argue that the Newman Hunters and Human Forces are just suboptimal choices and argue that there's really only 5 choices here. All because this is just race plus class, not race as subclass. And this simplifying also means that there's not even a basic attempt at a gun and tech hybrid class. I do wish that when I replayed it this year, I enjoyed Phantasy Star Zero more. It's very special to me being responsible for my whole Phantasy Star thing, and there are some good parts. I love the variety and number of areas in the game. Having photon arts as charged attacks and a weapon property is really fun, and I wish they did more and gave some weapons unique photon arts. And the visual design is impeccable for the DS's limitations. I just wish that for a game trying to go back to the style of the original PSO, it hadn't cut so much of what made Phantasy Star Online amazing. Now moving up to the B-tier games, these titles are cautious recommendations if you know what you're getting, and these happen to provide something that you want that the other games do not. First in B tier is Phantasy Star Universe Vanilla Offline, which of the PSU offline options, this is my favorite. Sure, the gameplay is limited without the online mode's class system and with some arbitrarily missing weapon types, but it has easily the best story mode of any of these games. Because it was designed basically as a self-contained thing, it could experiment with different mechanics like vehicle sections, have full voice acting, and be about a protagonist with a personality, even if it's not the most exciting, and who actually affects the story rather than being an avatar who's just along for the ride. And the game even has cutscenes, like proper freaking cutscenes. Honestly, the best production value on the cutscenes of any game in this frickin' series. PSU's offline mode is also fascinating for the fact that it preserves many early PSU mechanics, like the heavy focus on crafting. Aside from maybe being slightly short, this does feel like it could have been sold as a standalone action RPG at the time. It just wasn't what people wanted after PSO let you have basically the full experience offline, and that much is understandable, I guess. The big draw here is that the story is a masterclass in how to make a story that works for a primarily multiplayer game. It is a character-focused story, with the characters merely being participants in large battles, and while they are important, they don't, single-handedly determine the fate of the battle, leaving it easy to imagine your online mode characters are somewhere out there doing their own important parts of the fight. Ethan Weber is not some prophesized legendary hero who single-handedly saves Gerhal. At least not in this story. Ambition of the Illuminus makes him out to be way more important, and that apparently sticks, becoming his reputation in Portable 2. But in the original PSU story, Ethan is just some punk kid who shows promise and ends up joining the Guardians and does pretty well for himself. The impacts he makes tend to be smaller, personal things. At most, he saves a couple of important people, and the big final mission of the game isn't him single-handedly wiping out the Seed invasion. All that matters are the lives of him and his friends, and this is enough. It's enough to make him a hero, but not so overwhelmingly important that he is the only hero. Look, maybe this is me being a weird guy who likes to write and create characters and roleplay in games, but I like that this leaves room for me and everyone else to go, oh yeah, my character was also at this battle, and they did this cool thing. Plus, because there's plenty of rich world building with lots of detail, be sure to speak with your partner machine after each chapter for more details, even after it stops offering them in mandatory conversations. There's plenty of inspiration for where your character fits into this world. I mean, look, if you don't care about this stuff, I'm sure you're just fine with the story too, and can just ignore the story when you're in multiplayer, but I'd prefer not having to do this. I think having a story where you're not the only hero suits multiplayer games games better, and I just think it is more interesting because this is a kind of story we don't see a lot. And I don't know, maybe this sort of heroism is more inspiring and relevant to real life than the guy who single-handedly saves billions of lives. But regardless of my praise for PSU's base offline mode, it wasn't what people wanted at the time. PSO let you play the same character offline and online, whereas PSU Offline gave you a fixed protagonist and an extra mode where you could make your own protagonist, but had to play the story mode anyway to unlock missions. Then we have New Genesis. Maybe this is going to be controversial, putting the current game that people are currently invested in this low, especially when at this point the series is old enough that there's bound to be a number of PSO2 and New Genesis players who have never played any of the earlier games. But while NGS does do some things well, I just have different priorities from the kind of people this game is made for. I'm drawn to this series for the gameplay, the loot, and the progression, while the character customization and social elements, while always impressive, are more of bonuses to me. And this is my list after all, so I set the criteria. Look, NGS just isn't for me, but I do still think it's pretty alright. I don't consider myself a hater. It does have its unique selling points with the top-class character customization, almost too good, and the awesome private space customization. Plus, I do think an open-world PSO game could have been amazing, as is proven more by Xenoblade X than by PSO2. Especially since, sadly, New Genesis seems to have lost interest in being an open-world PSO. I nearly dropped it down to C tier because of that, but the open world's still there. You'll presumably still experience if you play it now for the first time. But while I did want them to lean into instant stuff, I didn't want them abandoning new open world content entirely. Without that, all it really has going for it in my book is the fact that it's nominally still updated and is more popular. For the base version of PSO2's gameplay and story, so without the open world, which was never that great to begin with, New Genesis is just inferior. Oh, what's that? Base's story has stopped being updated? Yeah, so has New Genesis's. Or functionally so, anyway. We're 4 years in and it still feels like it's on the epilogue to episode 1. Like they took that minor stuff you get after the main plot of an episode has been resolved, but before they're ready to start the next episode, and stretched it out for 2 years, a little mini episode and a few small scenes at a time. And we're well past the point of giving it the benefit of the doubt. Well, it does get some slack for, no doubt, being impacted by the pandemic. By the time PSO2 was 4.5 years old, it had already finished the epic Oracle saga and was in the process of jumping the shark with episode 4. New Genesis is still in the epilogue of its equivalent of episode 1. The game is designed to need a constant feed of new content, but they are really only giving the bare minimum. New instance missions, very, very rarely new bosses, new mini-episodes, sometimes new features, but never anything really exciting. Nothing you could call a new episode or expansion, and most critically, nothing to make players who have lapsed go, hey, that's some cool new stuff to do. I should go back to PSO2 for a month or two. Instead, it's coasting by, not quite in maintenance mode, but it's very close, and I feel like it's doing the bare minimum to retain current players, having seemingly fully given up on getting anyone to return to the game. It's only 4.5 years in. This is too early for it to feel this dead. Maybe I should have dropped this down to C rank. Now we're moving up to A tier, and these are great games that I really recommend any fan of action RPGs give a shot. First we have Phantasy Star Online, and this is probably the game I most enjoy experiencing online specifically. The compelling setting of Gurhal is realized through large hub areas and smaller interconnected lobbies, and just walking around gives me a sense of being in a world that none of the other games in the series provide. For some reason, the hub areas feel larger and more natural than the ones in the modern open world game. While loot isn't as interesting as it is in Phantasy Star Star Online, though it's still better than many later games in the series, there are still plenty of goals to pursue, whether it be farming new gear, acquiring and leveling up new photon arts, running current events, customizing your character's appearance and room, or good old level grinding. The gameplay and systems are solid, better than the watered-down versions, and the offline modes are portable, with decently satisfying attacks that can throw enemies around, balanced with design that still places emphasis on stats, status effects, and other RPG systems. And weapon swapping remains important. The class system, meanwhile, is my personal favorite in the series. 12 different advanced types you can choose between, playing with the 3 classic PSO playstyles in different ways. It's got character customization that I think still holds up well today, and player housing that, while flawed, was at a time when player housing was far from standard in online games. And all this comes with, I think, one of my favorite progression experiences ever. Obviously, the private server EXP boost helps with that a lot, but while I was on the trek to 190, I never felt like I was just trying to get EXP and raise one number. There were many smaller goals to pursue in the meantime. Early on, it was leveling my types to unlock the ones I wanted to focus on. Then it shifted to continuously finding better gear to farm for, as well as earning PA fragments to get rare photon arts and leveling up photon arts. And then late game, the gas system comes into play, giving you a little bit more motivation to level up. And if that all got boring, if I was early in the game and everything felt full of potential, or I just needed to unlock a certain mission, I could always travel from lobby to lobby, seeing where the missions take me. A good leveling experience is weirdly commonly ignored when it comes to online games like this. So many games end up either too grindy and empty, or too eager to rush you to the end and get you doing the important content. Hell, the interconnected lobby system I allude to is great, and I genuinely enjoyed when I had to pull up a guide on the wiki and navigate my way through several missions in order to get access to the mission I wanted to farm. It's morbidly funny that the actual open world game never had me setting my own goals and setting out on a journey like this. It reminds me of Final Fantasy XI, where I plotted a course from my starting city to a port town, all just to be able to get a spell that would be really helpful to me as a red mage. Though I will say that from what I've seen, the private server has been making progressing even easier than it was when I played around the middle of last year. This, well, I'll leave it up to you, but I'm not the biggest fan. I like playing PSU Online for the slow process of progressing, exploring, and having to figure out gearing myself. The game lets me access a bunch of convenient missions with easy access to good gear from one lobby. All just sounds a little less fun to me, and I say this as someone who did like the boosted EXP rates smoothing things out. It's a delicate balance any game, but especially private servers, have to walk between fixing hostile design but still maintaining a healthy amount of friction to keep things satisfying. Overall, PSU is the jack of all trades of the series. It may not have the top quality loot of PSO, the exciting gameplay of PSO2 or Portable 2, or even some of the unique features of NGS, but it's great to experience and doesn't have any really serious rough edges that could turn a player off. Plus, the type system is really compelling and the progression experience is top-notch. I feel like it's underappreciated for many reasons. Living in PSO's shadow, having an offline mode that wasn't what people wanted, making a terrible first impression that probably means that many people who would have enjoyed it just never tried the online mode, and being poorly handled in the West. But none of those really matter today, so give it a shot. And then there's PSO2. Look, I prefer more methodical combat that focuses on RPG systems in my action RPGs. To me, that's just a more synergistic approach, since it creates combat that directly benefits from being an RPG and from being multiplayer, rather than trying to be a full-fledged action game but falling short because that clashes with the RPG systems and the multiplayer. And yet, PSO2 is a blast to play, and it's only really outmatched by dedicated action games like God of War or Devil May Cry. There's undeniably a visceral satisfaction to this style of combat that the older games lack, and it's much easier to find and engage with the fun parts of this than to do so with the fun parts of a more slow, systems-heavy approach. There are many positives about PSO2, but the combat is always the first and foremost among them. The advantages it has, both in general and over NGS specifically, depend on whether you look at the base classes or Scion classes. Scion classes being basically late-game superpowered classes added in episodes 5 and 6. Base classes have more weight to their combat and play more methodically, not to mention having a wide variety of photon arts at their disposal. They're grounded and expressive, and you feel the impact of each action and the presence of each enemy. Plus you spend fairly little time just ignoring gravity while you spam mid-air attacks. There's a modicum of thought that goes into what photon art you use and how you chain them together. Something as simple as juggling enemies is nice, and yeah, you still have to be thoughtful about your positioning. Meanwhile, Scion classes are far more compelling power fantasies than NGS classes. Even when NGS classes do borrow some mechanics from Scion classes just have more mechanics to keep track of and more different inputs at your disposal. Some may find it overwhelming, sure, but my video and I like it. Not to mention they're much faster and have sharper animations, and generally feel quite satisfying as a Twitch action game. The impact of animations on the feel of an action game is something that I think is woefully overlooked. Scion classes are exciting and feel powerful, while NGS classes feel like you're slowly swiping at thin air. And look, the story isn't anything that'll change your life or anything, but the first 3 episodes at least were quite compelling. Well, episodes 2 and 3 are. Episode 1 is a slow burn that focuses on developing the world and the characters at the cost of pacing, only really getting good near the end. And it really suffers from the new watch a whole bunch of cutscenes from a menu approach. But in episodes 2 and 3 there's some compelling world building, and PSO2 is shown to actually have a really cool and unique sci-fi setting and great characters. The characters do a great job of providing a lot of examples of normal ARCS members, letting you know what life is like for people who aren't protagonists, which I think is the second best thing for a multiplayer game story, after something like PSU's story. So while PSO2 isn't my favorite, and honestly probably is the bottom of A tier for me, it's still enjoyable, and I sure as hell wouldn't turn down a private server that refines the experience. Or hell, progression servers, like how they ran the game when it first came out west. I'm of the opinion that progression and playing the story are the best parts here. And lastly, we have Phantasy Star Portable 2. Once upon a time, I thought this would be going in S tier. Sadly, it falls ever so slightly short, mostly because it's not the straight upgrade from PSU that I thought it was. The main areas it falls short in are, well, the things that PSU did best. The type selection is cut down from 12 to 4. Progression is heavily focused on just leveling up. There's a bit less depth, with photon arts being much more focused on raw damage due to the new chain system. Armor units go from one of their more unique incarnations to easily the most boring version of them. And do not get me started on the story again, but in exchange, we get a few amazing steps forward for the series. Honestly, my favorite action combat system. It's still methodical, and the simple addition of chains and a few defensive options make for a great combat rhythm. There's a skill system for the first time in the series. They even return to the PSO style of wanting you to do a bit of everything. The only game to really embrace that style since the original PSO. Portable 2 is really great, not perfect, but honestly probably the easiest to recommend, or at least it would be without the story. It's more of an action game, so it's easier for the average person to understand and appreciate than PSO or PSU. It's something you can play solo offline, unlike PSU or PSO2, and you can get the most of the experience in a reasonable amount of time, unlike any of the non-handheld games. And it's by far the best, most complete handheld title in the franchise. I don't know, maybe Nova will be a surprise and take that title, but it's not on the list because I haven't been able to get set up to play it, and didn't have time anyway. It's just that, man, maybe this should be S tier, but I can't escape the shadow of how much better it could have been. That is, I guess, the downside of being one of the few games in the series that can be directly compared to any other. It's very easy to say how it could be better. This would be an easy S tier without PSU. It was an S tier before I played PSU. Hell, maybe without PSO2, New Genesis might be up in A tier. I guess that's just the nature of comparison though, and maybe also a side benefit to tier lists, right? I've wound up with a list that's mostly balanced across the tiers, so I'm probably not being overly harsh or overly generous. But the fact that Portable 2 falls short in the areas that I like best about PSU is just a really hard thing to overlook, because I can so clearly see a hypothetical version of this game that keeps a few more things from PSU, and the only thing that I don't absolutely adore about that version is the lack of the original PSO's incredible loot design. This game could have been nearly perfect. Heck, it could have been the basis for a perfect Phantasy Star Universe 2, but it wasn't, and that just means I just can't bring myself to bump it up to S tier. Then in S tier, which I have reserved for masterpieces, you can tell by process of elimination, there's only one game left. And I've debated this, right? It feels too obvious. Like it's the answer I'd give here because it's the one everyone would expect. Especially having come into the fandom at a time when there was a strong backlash to everything after it. And yet, the sole S-tier game, because it is the one I most enjoy returning to, is of course the original Phantasy Star Online. And before you say it, no, this isn't nostalgia. I started with Phantasy Star Zero. And while I would play PSO on private servers a little bit later on, I wouldn't really get it until more recently. And now, well, I've seen the real highlights of the game, and I could get into it, and I will in fact. The next section is all about why I think PSO is both the best and impossible to recreate, but really I think the reason I like this game best is simple. These are games about killing shit and getting loot. PSO has the best loot. Unique items aren't just a linear power progression, with special attacks and other features allowing them to define your playstyle in interesting ways. And you're free to pursue whatever gear you want, and the game isn't focused on constantly running the newest high-level content like is often the case with more modern online games that do get updates. More than any other game, I know I can always come back, look at a drop table, go, that looks neat, and do a few runs in hopes of getting it. And the solid enemy variety helps a lot too, with gameplay just deep enough that the enemies can force you to adopt different tactics, ensuring that things don't get old as quickly. But while the original PSO is my favorite game in the series, it's also the hardest to recommend. There's some elements of jank that come from the game being older, not to mention the fact that the game is designed to be played over the lower-end internet of the time. A lot of the non-standard systems that I love could be turn-offs to others, and the gameplay is very much RPG gameplay, where you apply every tool you have to efficiently deal with the situation at hand, lacking the more flexible combat of PSU or the more visceral action combat of later titles. Not to mention the start of the game, really the whole of normal mode, is honestly a pretty slow start that doesn't sell the game as well as it could. In the end, it's just a matter of what I value in games, I guess. The original PSO helped mold how I look at games and made me a little more open-minded. It's a game that didn't fit with my initial expectations. I had to take my time to understand it and learn how it wanted me to play it, and learn how its systems fit together. Often when the game did something that could be seen in isolation as bad design, it ultimately does fit with the other systems perfectly. So yeah, PSO is S tier, shocking nobody. And a lot of people, quite understandably, want a remake or remaster or something else of this game, but I don't quite think that'd work, and the fact that it wouldn't work is a section all its own. So much of what makes PSO unique and beloved is particular to its era. See, a lot of early online RPGs were not designed in the image of other online RPGs. Instead, they took more design cues from the contemporary single-player RPGs, because there were very few other online RPGs to copy, and what an online RPG is and is expected to be hadn't been solidified. And that makes for a game that is uniquely compelling, but also not exactly approachable. And there's so many things in PSO that would break if you tried to redesign them to fit what people expect today. Take the combat, for instance. It needs to be methodical. The original PSO is a game where things like status effects really matter, where range and animation and area of effect are all critical factors, where Rob Arta is an incredibly useful tech for a hunter just for being able to give you some space to work. Some people might assume that the combat can be replaced because it was just a product of the limitations of its time, but the slow pace and limited defensive options are a lot of why the combat sandbox is as interesting as it is. Something like freezing enemies stops being worth it if you can easily iframe every attack or just kill them before they ever become a threat. And also, you have to think a lot more about positioning because it's the only thing keeping you alive and you can't just reposition risk-free. And the game would also need to retain the accuracy mechanic. Special attacks are a constant choice in combat that do a lot of the work of making gear unique and allowing you to play in different ways. And they're balanced largely around accuracy, providing a moment-to-moment choice of whether to risk less accuracy for the additional effects these special attacks provide. And in turn, this means that accuracy is functionally the be better with special attacks stat, which is compelling. But people don't like having dice rolls miss attacks in an action game, which is understandable. It can be annoying to hit something but be told you missed, but PSO is one of the few games that uses an accuracy system in interesting ways. To remove it would flatten the experience and make it all simpler. Another thing that would be tricky to preserve is that utility is prized in PSO far more than in most games. In so many games, including many of PSO's sequels, things can degrade into just do one thing and hit the enemies as hard as possible. There's nothing that requires you to do things differently, but PSO is very much about utility. As an example, I mostly play Hunters, the melee class, but I still usually find I need a ranged weapon to shoot certain enemies that like to hover out of reach, and there are a variety of useful techniques. Crowd control with Rob Arta, cheesing certain fights with Rafoy, or just generally offsetting the Newman Hunter's lower stats with Shifter and D-Ban. And you'll typically carry multiple weapons of your main type. Again, as a hunter, I usually find myself, at the very least, needing a sword or partisan for AoE, along with daggers, twin swords, or a double saber for high single target damage. PSO is very much a game about developing your toolkit and being ready for anything, which is also something that helps keeps its loot pool exciting. It's critical to the experience, and yet it's something that would be easy to lose in a remake, or which many players might not get if the game was remastered. Now granted, there could be room to improve the combat in a hypothetical remake. Maybe some action combat like in Zero or Portable 2 could work if you wanted to modernize PSO. Adding a dodge roll and making enemies a bit more aggressive to compensate could probably still be compatible with what made PSO great. But full PSO 2 action combat would just not be compatible with the things that made PSO good. And it's fine if you prefer that, but if you're suggesting that, it would really be a PSO remake in name only. And unfortunately, I think people's expectations for something like that would make a straight re-release of PSO less popular. And the systems, if anything, would make a remake even more difficult. Like, the class system is weird. Having the different species be effectively totally different classes is fine, even cool compared to games where species differences tend to be a matter of optimization with a clear right choice. Like, most of the later PSO games. But having things like male and female human rangers be vastly different subclasses is super fucking weird. Even a minor stat boost one way or the other for a given sex is considered out of fashion these days, which is good. But if you just make the male and female versions the same in PSO, then you end up doing a Phantasy Star 0 and cutting the classes down from 12 to 7. So then they'd have to add in new options to replace what they lost in consolidation. It could be done, of course, but it is a hazard to watch out for. And again, it's entirely possible they just pull a Phantasy Star 0 and don't do this. Then there's also mags and materials, which do not work with modern tastes in games. They require a focus on the minutia of stats that most modern games don't have. Materials especially wouldn't go down well, as being able to permanently fuck up your character is thankfully no longer in vogue. Though this is easily fixed, and even the PSO private servers have fixed it. Then the loot system, which I think is very good, but isn't in line with modern expectations. And people often don't like when something is different. Loot in PSO doesn't have levels, progression isn't smooth or quick, and there's no constant stream of new gear with bigger numbers. You have a few tiers of basic gear with random special abilities, but then in hard mode you start getting to a point where you're mostly dealing with unique gear, which is rare and is pretty widely spaced, and this is great. When you get a rare weapon that you use, not only will it usually be a pretty big upgrade, adding to the excitement of acquiring it, but you'll also probably keep using it for quite a while, letting it leave an impression on you and be part of your character's story. There's no getting a lucky rare drop only to have it be worse than common gear in a few hours. Especially when unique equipment will always outpace common stuff in raw power. Instead, the main value of common gear is the fact that it can have any special attack, which may sometimes mean it's the only way to get a certain weapon class with a certain special attack. This creates a very non-linear sort of late game progression when combined with the emphasis on different weapon types and weapon specials. It's not all just running the one or two pieces of content that give all the universally best gear, and it's rarely as simple as just a single best thing either. Unique weapons are unique with fixed special attacks and unique traits, so it's not just all about which gear has the biggest number. This also lends itself to the fact that the game isn't built to be played like most modern games. There's not a focused end game for you to rush to and then grind tediously on, and instead it's much more about the journey, with end game mostly being farming for the absolute rarest shit, not because it's optimal, but just because it's cool, and what else are you supposed to do? This is something for you to do with your friends. Fortunately, the loot is cool, it's worth collecting just for it being unique, and oftentimes you may find yourself getting other neat rare items that weren't even what you were farming for. Who knows, maybe today this system would indeed be praised for being something unique. Certainly I would hope so, because obviously I like it for being unique, but I worry it might be changed just to be more normal, or that people wouldn't be happy without a routine dopamine hit. Some of this really does get to the heart of the fact that online games at this time hadn't yet been cynically optimized for engagement and retention. Obviously those things are important, but like old games at this time mostly thought to do it by like just being good games, and maybe by being slow enough that you can play them for a really long time, rather than the hyper-cynical, manipulative tactics of more modern online games. Plus, so many systems in PSO were designed to be mysterious. They work well with a guide, but not really without one. Like there's mags as mentioned, little stat boosting robots with complex raising mechanics, where it's tricky to raise just the stats you want, and with many factors along the way to take into account. What stat boosts you want, which photon blasts you want, what actions you want, and if you want a particular appearance. Building a good mag is a research project, and I like it, but it's also a lot of potentially screwing yourself that can turn off new players. Then there's the way the unique traits of gear was so rarely spelled out, which is a shame because these traits are what made PSO's gear so special. And of course there's section IDs, an iconic part of the game that I think everyone new to it would hate. The drop tables you get are determined by your name and class, and unless you use a calculator, this may as well be completely random. Even in the later versions where they did add your class factoring in, like they didn't make it so that you'd be any more likely to get a good one for your class or anything. There are some perks to this, because the game does encourage you to do a bit of everything. It helps further differentiate your playthroughs, and it provides an extra incentive to playing with others. When playing in a group, the host's section ID is the one that determines the drop charts. or just encouraging you to level alts. But it can also mean you end up with a character unable to get any loot that's good for them. Even if you just let players choose, which I absolutely would do if I were re-releasing PSO today, it may still feel shitty if the player finds a unique weapon that they wanted just isn't available with their section ID. And perhaps, most of all, this is all designed in a way that is fundamentally different from most modern online RPGs. It is designed as a thing that is finite. They couldn't really add much of anything beyond what was on the discs that shipped when the original PSO released. The game is designed to be playable for potentially thousands of hours, but does this through a variety of options and not having one singular best thing to pursue. DLC and updates weren't a thing for console games at the time, so this was the only way to make a game that could last this long. And unfortunately, while I can see this approach pleasing some players, I certainly can't imagine it pleasing a company in 2025. Then we have the matter of the game's impact and its environment. And this is as close as I'm going to get to crediting nostalgia for why people like PSO. Yes, nostalgia is a factor, of course it is, but I dislike how it's brought up when talking about games like this. Too often it's just used as a blunt instrument to discredit the opinions of fans of an older thing. Usually out of a failure or unwillingness to try and understand the thing, which is in turn sometimes born from the older fans not articulating things well. And why yes, I am a Monster Hunter fan, how could you tell? But I think that often nostalgia is just the result of something being exciting and new, and then time passing. Humans do, after all, tend to like new and innovative things. But as time passes, we can remember the positive feelings, but as the innovations that spurred them become commonplace, these feelings, half remembered, can be hard to articulate and impossible to recapture. And Phantasy Star Online would have been a huge first for so many players. I really can't hope to articulate to those younger than me how different the idea of going online was back in the aughts. We were not constantly connected by smartphones and social media. If you wanted to talk to someone over the internet, you had to go home and sit at a computer and find them on the particular thing you met them through. Or, thanks to PSO, sit at a game console and interact with them through the game you met them in. And that's assuming you had internet and this was an option for you at all. For a good portion of the aughts, it wasn't that weird if you didn't have internet. It was exciting and new and had none of the unpleasantness many people now feel regarding social media and the like, and that gave it a certain magic that no remake could capture. So really, it's not even just that PSO was fresh, but that the world around it was different. PSO is just too grounded in the time it was from. I am very skeptical that any remake would be willing to try and be faithful of it, because I think a lot of new players would find it boring at first glance. And with the slow start, a lot of players wouldn't stick around long enough to find the charm, even if it did ultimately appeal to them. And don't take this as an endorsement of the fact that PSO does take a while to get good. I think that the amount of time it takes for the good parts of it to become obvious are a flaw with the game. I just don't necessarily know how you fix them, and it is how the game is. And a lot of these issues would also crop up if Sega tried to make a new Phantasy Star in the style of the original, or if any indie creators out there wanted to try and make a spiritual successor. But honestly, this whole thing was just a excuse to talk about why the original PSO was so unique, and besides that, a new game or spiritual successor would have more room to innovate. These would be issues with recapturing the feel of the original PSO, but it wouldn't have to capture it exactly. But as for how to re-release the original PSO, it's a tricky question. You couldn't just do a remaster. I mean, you could, but I think it would be a bad idea. There's all the older systems I talked about that may not resonate with newer players. Plus, I increasingly dislike remasters and would rather have straight ports. Look, I originally wrote this passage a while ago, right after the announcement of the Deus Ex remaster. That's a game from the same year as PSO, and while I do think Deus Ex's visuals have aged less gracefully than PSO's, the Deus Ex remaster just looks awful. A few things look a little better, but the lighting is terrible, showing how you can't just slap dynamic lighting on a game originally made for baked-in lighting and expect it to look good. The things they improved don't exactly look modern and still look 10 to 15 years old, and the parts that they didn't polish up stick out like a sore thumb. Like many of the models with new, higher quality textures, but the same visible polygon count. And once again, I think that PSO's graphics have aged way better than Deus Ex's, thanks to PSO being more stylized and anime influenced. So for a remaster, this would just mean that they have a greater capacity to fuck it up. Then if they went for a full-fledged remake, it'd be a struggle to keep the soul of the original. It's a game where it could be very difficult to discern what to keep and what to change, given that the game's own sequels don't seem to understand what was great about it. So simply aiming to modernize is likely to sweep away many of the charms, changing things simply because they're not how modern games do things, and changing things that should have been left as is. It would be very easy to lose too much of what made the game special while just keeping superficial elements. You know, like Phantasy Star Zero did. Or just as easily it could lapse into the third category, which is also probably the best case, honestly, which is a Final Fantasy VII remake kind of situation. A game that is good, even great, but so fundamentally different from the original that no one could claim it's a substitute, except as part of some disingenuous argument from someone who disliked the original. A reimagining, in other words. But I'm sorry, I'm just kind of tired of these. Look, I loved RE2 Remake as much as the next guy, but increasingly I don't even see the point of these. They just confuse things, making people think they just need to play one when really they're two entirely different games that can't really be directly compared or substituted. And these days I'm left thinking I would rather just have a port of the original game along with a new game in the series. And even if they did just do a port, in addition to the difficulty selling new players on the systems, there's the question of what would actually be gained, and why not just play on the private servers instead. It's not difficult to set up or anything, and there's a variety of them, so you can have whatever sort of experience you want, whether that's an authentic experience or a modernized one. An official port could at least likely draw in more players for a little while, but because this is the kind of game that a lot of people would find difficult to get into, I worry it might not go so well. Plus there's the fact that even with more people playing video games than ever before, there's also far more online games than ever before, splitting players between them. I'm worried this temporarily larger population wouldn't last, while this would also put Sega in conflict with the fan servers. Normally I would prefer a straight port, but here maybe that's not so great, and it's likely many players would prefer the private servers. Look, I'm not saying you couldn't, strictly speaking, remake PSO, but you'd need the right team. People who appreciate the original, but aren't uncritical of it and just accepting everything about it as good at face value. People who can articulate what made PSO special and understand where it can be improved without losing too much of the original. So, me. Sega, hire me. Sure, I have no actual qualifications in game development and I'm just a Z-list YouTuber, but I could totally do it. Totally. Why are you laughing? So the original PSO never has and probably never will be replicated. So after 25 years, the question becomes, what is PSO's legacy? That often becomes how you have to start looking at games at this point. A lot of its mechanics got dropped as the series went on. For instance, probably my favorite thing that could have been a legacy but wasn't is the focus on having the right weapon for the situation. Swapping weapons was a major part of the combat loop in PSO and PSU. In PSO, if you wanted to deal with multiple enemies as a hunter or ranger, you needed a weapon specialized in doing so, while doing high DPS would require a different multi-hit weapon. Weapon special attacks further differentiate weapons, letting certain ones excel at keeping you alive or at crowd control. And this was a lot of what made unique weapons so interesting in the first game. They were a piece of your toolkit, not just a bigger number that applies to everything. PSU, meanwhile, did make melee weapons a bit more all-purpose via skill photon arts, but these skill photon arts did have distinct advantages over one another, making it worthwhile to consider using the right one for the job. The focus was just now more on the photon art than the weapon providing it. But ranged weapons were still very advantageous as a sidearm, and they were still quite heavily defined by their weapon class. And casting techniques now required you to switch to a casting weapon, actually adding a bit more to the weapon swapping mechanic. And of course, the element system meant you needed a collection of different options, usually a few different ones for any given mission, in order to deal optimal damage. But in later games, it's become less and less important. It's much easier in PSO2 to just fight your way through with your preferred weapon type and not switch very much. Photon arts now provide most of your toolkit. Each class only gets a few weapon types, and usually there will be one element that can work for most enemies in a given mission. With Scion classes, this would be pushed even further, as they were so fast and so powerful that any one weapon really could do it all. Then NGS, to its credit, at least tried to make it a bit better, introducing the multi-weapon system to let you combine two weapon types and use their full move set. But NGS is also a much grindier game, and because it's so stat-focused, this really strongly discourages having multiple weapon types that you use. Plus, elements were downplayed, further reducing the reason to have a variety of weapons for coverage. And honestly, I couldn't even tell you how worthwhile it might be to get a multi-weapon setup. I mained Slayer, and they only get one weapon type. Luster back in PSO2 base also had this quirk, but they had different stances based on weapon element, so they still had a reason to acquire and switch between multiple different weapons. Sure, I could have used weapons from my subclass, but then I wouldn't have access to the weapon's full power, and I would also not be fueling the Slayer skills that only trigger off of gun blades, so I'd be decidedly suboptimal. And so honestly, I mostly just used my subclass weapons to keep things fresh while playing easy content. But at least I do remember back when I played Braver, I did appreciate being able to have some bow attacks available while mostly using a katana. So maybe multi-weapons do help, but NGS also gives us classes that cannot effectively switch weapons at all. And few other games really pick this up, if any. Monster Hunter, by far the most successful online game that takes after PSO, locked you into a single weapon for a given quest until the most recent titles. Maybe Dark Souls and its successors do a bit of this, I guess. It's not strictly necessary in those games to carry an armory and switch between options on the fly, but it's at least possible. Of course, maybe this was all inevitable. A focus on gear switching requires gear to have a sufficient variety of unique traits to create situational advantages. If gear's just making your numbers bigger, there's only ever going to be one right choice. And the focus on bigger numbers has sadly become the default for most multiplayer RPGs. And sadly, this is only the most prominent thing from PSO that hasn't left much of a legacy. PSO isn't Diablo. It doesn't have spiritual successors trying to recapture the experience it provided. If you're a Diablo fan, even if you hated everything after 2, there's still stuff like Torchlight or Path of Exile, beloved spiritual successors. But there's really nothing out there that tries to revive any of PSO's core mechanics. So what legacy is left? Well, I think there are 3 pieces of PSO's legacy that live on till today. First is the way it raised the bar on character customization. PSO has always been well ahead of the industry standard on this. The original game's character customization may seem limited to us now due to being inseparable from your class, but for the year 2000, it was well ahead of most well-known games from the era. Its proportion sliders and RGB sliders for hair color wouldn't become the norm for many, many more years. Phantasy Star Universe, meanwhile, has character customization that still holds up today. It may be lacking the sheer volume of sliders that are the norm today, but these are often a bit much in my opinion. They make creating your character a lot harder for a detail that you won't usually notice. And then PSO2 was one of the first games to have this sort of crazy character customization with the sort of excessive detail that has since become the norm. Although frankly I would say that the way PSO2 implements its customization options make it a little easier to use, with much more intuitive sections to drag and adjust than the endless field of sliders that most games' character customization use. And now New Genesis is known for how crazy you can get with its accessories and such, building on top of PSO2's character customization. Hell, even Phantasy Star Zero, the little Nintendo DS game, I mean, you didn't have a ton of options, but you still had more options than most DS games give you. And then there's socialization, which is maybe too obvious, or maybe giving it too much credit, honestly, but there's always something special about socializing in these games. PSO was simply one of the first times people ever got to communicate online in a console game like this. PSU was clearly designed with a lot of spaces intended for socialization, including player housing at a time that it wasn't the most typical. Plus, I recall it being mentioned both in a comment in one of these videos and on PSO World back in the day that the Xbox 360 version had a free demo that people would play just to use as a chat room. And in New Genesis, most of my fondest memories come from other players, especially in the early days of private spaces 2.5 years ago. I remember various parties and events and checking out what other people built. Heck, even when I went back to New Genesis this summer, the best thing about it was the fact that I made a new friend. Sure, some people may turn their nose up at the fact I'm complimenting this series for also being great at being just basically chat rooms with customizable 3D avatars, but hey, there's some programs out there that try and do just that without the game and don't do it as well as the Phantasy Star Online series. So that's gotta count for something in its favor, right? So, New Genesis still carries some of the torches that PSO lit. Just, it also dropped the ones that I most wanted to see it carry on. Maybe it's inevitable that the unique gameplay mechanics got worn down over time. Unless you have a game series that is extremely strongly tied to its gameplay like Devil May Cry, it's kind of hard to keep a franchise going on the back of gameplay mechanics alone. Plus, while its specific mechanics may not have left as much of a legacy, PSO's genre did. Simply being the first online console RPG remains a pretty strong legacy. Without PSO, we may never have had Monster Hunter or multiplayer in Dark Souls. Perhaps the saddest part about PSO's long absence from the West and general decline is that in the 2010s, it was an incredible time to be a Japanese, console-first action RPG with online features. But PSO was nowhere to be found to take advantage of it. In some ways, I'm sure that online gaming was inevitable. Phantasy Star Online was a critical moment, but this was probably going to always happen. I mean, if nothing else, PCs were a bit ahead on this front, and living now in an era where PC and console gaming have greatly converged, it's certain that online gaming would have gotten big on consoles somewhere along the way. So in another world without PSO, I'm sure online gaming in 2025 isn't much different. But that's not the world we live in. Instead, we live in a world where Phantasy Star Online laid the groundwork for the online 3D Japanese console action RPG. Every wyvern slain in Monster Hunter, every bug squashed in EDF, every kick-ass Dark Souls PvP duel, all these moments owe something to Phantasy Star Online, so it still deserves the hype. At the same time, I have to wonder if maybe some parts of the series' path was just inevitable. I can't help but see parallels between PSO and Diablo, a series whose first game inspired PSO and whose second game was PSO's main competition. Both games had a massive hit in 2000 with PSO and Diablo 2, then their follow-ups, PSO and Diablo 3, were both more online focused and controversial, causing problems for their series. PSU was followed by a gradual decline until the series went Japan only for 10 years, and Diablo coasted on DLC for around 10 years. Though to be fair to Diablo, there was a long break between 2 and 3 as well, though maybe that's because Blizzard was busy making World of Warcraft and its most beloved expansions. And then both franchises made comebacks in the 2020s with their new titles, probably bringing them more relevance than they'd seen since 2000, but still earning the ire of many longtime fans. I mean, maybe this is all just coincidence, but I suspect some degree of industry forces simply have made it hard for this sort of game. MMOs went from kind of niche to being a big deal in the aughts, making online RPGs in general a huge thing. There was suddenly tons of competition, and these games couldn't stand out just by being online RPGs anymore. And now there was conflicting pressure to both conform and to have a unique hook to stand out. Plus, game development was getting increasingly business-driven as the industry got larger, expectations were higher, and budgets became inflated. And this is all putting aside the roller coaster ride there's been public perception of RPGs, especially Japanese RPGs, over these 25 years. These days, things have looped back around to these kinds of games being rare and hard to make, yet not able to feel unique because online games are so normalized now. And heck, I think PSO becoming more and more of an MMO might have been a mistake in the long term. It worked out for a while with PSU and PSO2 riding the rise of the genre, but these days MMOs just seem to be too much work for most companies. There are other ways to make a live service game that are much less expensive and more profitable. PSO's current incarnation of New Genesis has slowed to a crawl. Meanwhile, Monster Hunter has proven that there is still an audience that wants this sort of Japanese console-based co-op RPG that the original PSO and the handheld titles provided. Games that maybe get some updates, but still have a finite amount of content, and where both the devs and players will eventually move on to the next title. It'd be great for Monster Hunter to have some competition in that niche, but not only would it be hard for a game series like PSO to go smaller after PSO2 and New Genesis were bordering on full-fledged MMOs, I just don't know if Phantasy Star is even a priority anymore. As seen by how New Genesis is just barely getting enough support and new content to not count as being in maintenance mode. Unless the reason for this is that they're actually putting most of their resources into a new game in the series. So I wish I could end this retrospective on a brighter note. I don't know, maybe for the 25th anniversary they'll announce something cool and you all in the comments will be celebrating while I scramble to get a quick video made. But I also don't need them to do anything for the 25th. Which is good because I really don't expect much beyond maybe a bit of NGS content. Though unfortunately, according to the Headline Wave video from November 25th, it doesn't seem like there's going to be a ton of PSO content for New Genesis for the anniversary either. A new returning boss fight that's Dark Falls Luther from PSO2 base, a new 14-star weapon rarity with a weapon series using designs based on iconic, unique weapons from PSO. Okay, that's neat. Good even, that's what I'd want them to do. There's a new festival thing that includes rappies that use the old PSO rag rappy design. There's some new decorations, including some PSO-themed posters, and a whole lot of free scratch tickets, which, I mean, is pretty great if you play the game. Plus, you know, a lot of the usual small shit that NGS updates come with. Mostly stuff to spend money on scratch tickets to try and get. And some stuff to help pretend that the game's still getting meaningful updates. You know the drill. They don't even seem to really push this as a PSO anniversary thing all that hard outside of one small part of the video, when the new weapons and rag rappies at the very least are clearly PSO anniversary bits. I mean, I guess it's also doing triple duty as the holiday and half anniversary events, though I'm not sure if half anniversary is that much worth celebrating. And I would have at very least liked the scratch ticket with outfits based on the original 12 PSO classes. I guess there's a summer vacation themed PSO2 Essential scratch ticket instead. I guess it's Phantasy Star related. But after all of this, I mean, I also don't really need much unless they want to give us an actual new game announcement. We have private servers and emulators to provide the classics for. Yeah, it's not the same, but in a lot of ways it can be better. Emulation is a lot better at preserving console games long-term than ports are, and private servers can help deal with the fact that online games like PSO and PSU were not always designed for the best player experience, but designed deliberately to draw out leveling for as long as possible to get more sweet subscription fees out of you. The changes may not always be to my preferences, but I do at least appreciate the attempt and the possibilities. And for those of you still watching, thank you. Especially if you have been following this series of videos for a while, or even if you just found them last month but went back and watched all of them. I don't know what comes next for me. I've kind of done the big thing I wanted to do on YouTube, and I should probably focus on other things in life. I don't think I'll keep up with the monthly videos, not unless this video suddenly slingshots me to the point where I can start considering making this a real job, and that feels unlikely. But hey, 2025 has been a good year for me, even if things have slowed down in the back half of the year, so maybe I'll get lucky here. And I do still plan on covering PSO Episode 3 as well as the Master System and Genesis games sometime. Plus I do want to give Nova a shot, and maybe someday I'll even talk about the 2 anime series. And I want to do a bit more Monster Hunter stuff too. So don't worry and don't think about unsubscribing, the channel won't be going anywhere. It'll just probably be a little slower. But hey, the video's still going, so how about if we end on a better note? So here, I want you to celebrate the 25 years of PSO by just playing any of the games from it. Ideally one that you haven't given a fair shake. If you're younger or just new to the series and never played it, give one of the PSO Blueburst private servers a shot. It's not the easiest to get into, but if you can enjoy it enough to get further in, it'll really start to shine. Or if you're an original PSO purist, why not give Universe, Portable 2, or even Online 2 another shot? Just go in with the idea in mind that these games are very different from PSO, but they're in the same boat where their best ideas have largely been abandoned by the series, and so they're all kind of equal. You might find that the games are a lot better when you're not expecting them to be something they aren't. So let me know in the comments below what game in the series you'll be going back to for the anniversary. I kind of want to get hooked back on the original PSO, level up a bit more, and start farming for the really rare shit, so I might do that. Or maybe since it's been a while since I've played much PSU, I'll go back to Gurhal. While you're down there, why don't you also tell me some of your favorite memories with the series? For me, it's just mostly the fact that going on to PSO World thanks to Phantasy Star Zero led me to so much of where I'm at in life now. I wouldn't have met any of the friends who I enjoy talking to today if not for that silly little side game on the DS. But for now, this is Mikhail, that guy who does all those PSO videos, signing off.